He rose from obscurity to become the most feared man on earth. Adolf Hitler, a dictator whose words could ignite nations and whose orders brought death to millions. But behind the propaganda and the speeches, a mind obsessed with power and war. Every plan, every strategy, every life changed by his ambition. This is the story of the man who shook the world and left a legacy of terror that still haunts history. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20th, 1889, in Braunau am Inn, a small border town in Austria-Hungary. The son of Alois Hitler, a strict customs officer, and Clara Hitler, a gentle, deeply religious mother, young Adolf grew up under the shadow of an authoritarian father and a family haunted by early deaths. Alois was a man feared by his family. His temper was violent, his discipline merciless. He wanted Adolf to follow in his footsteps as a customs officer, but the boy dreamed of art, of painting cathedrals and grand buildings, dreams Alois dismissed with scorn and beatings. Hitler's early school years were marked by conflict and failure. Once a promising student, he became defiant, hostile to authority, and repeatedly clashed with teachers. By the time he was a teenager, he had dropped out, rejecting the path his father had set for him. In 1903, Alois Hitler died suddenly. At just 14, Adolf was freed from his father's control, but also from the family's stability. His mother, Clara, became the center of his world. Her approval, love, and gentle nature provided the only warmth in his life. Hitler's adolescence was marked by increasing isolation. He spent hours reading about German history, mythology, and nationalism, nurturing a belief in Germany's cultural superiority. This mix of loneliness, resentment, and growing ideological obsession would later fuel his dangerous worldview. At 16, Hitler left school for good and drifted aimlessly. He lived off his mother's modest support, painting watercolors and dreaming of becoming a great artist. But his applications to the prestigious Vienna Academy of Fine Arts were twice rejected, crushing his ambitions. These failures deepened his bitterness. He began blaming others for his misfortunes: teachers, art critics, and increasingly, Jews, whom he saw as scapegoats for everything wrong in his life. In Vienna, Hitler first encountered the city's virulent anti-Semitic politics, which left a lasting mark. Tragedy struck again in 1907 when Clara Hitler died of cancer. Her death devastated Adolf, leaving him untethered and without purpose. The grief pushed him deeper into resentment and isolation, setting the stage for his descent into extremism. After her death, Hitler squandered his inheritance and drifted into poverty. He lived in Vienna's flophouses and shelters, selling cheap sketches to survive. Hunger, humiliation, and growing hatred hardened him. The failed artist was transforming into the angry radical. By the time Hitler left Vienna for Munich in 1913, he was no longer just a failed art student. He was a man consumed by grievance, intoxicated by nationalist propaganda, and primed for a cause, any cause, that would give his life meaning. In 1914, Adolf Hitler left behind his life of poverty in Vienna and Munich to join the German army. For a man who had failed in school, art, and family, the war offered purpose. Here, he would find discipline, comradeship, and a cause to fill his emptiness. Assigned as a dispatch runner, Hitler carried messages across deadly battlefields. It was dangerous work, demanding nerves of steel. Amid mud and blood, he showed a willingness to risk his life. Fellow soldiers described him as quiet, withdrawn, but intensely loyal to the German cause. The trenches of the Western Front shaped him. Endless mud, lice, gas attacks, and shellfire destroyed millions. For Hitler, the battlefield became both a crucible and a stage, a place where he believed Germany's destiny would be decided. Twice wounded and once temporarily blinded by mustard gas, Hitler narrowly survived the slaughter. He received the Iron Cross for bravery, an honor he wore with pride. The war gave him something he had always lacked: recognition. But Germany did not win the war. In November 1918, as Hitler lay in a military hospital recovering from gas exposure, news arrived. The Kaiser abdicated, Germany surrendered, and the war was lost. The defeat shattered him. The Treaty of Versailles soon followed, humiliating Germany with crushing reparations and territorial losses. For Hitler, this was betrayal, not by soldiers, but by politicians, Jews, and socialists. This stab-in-the-back myth became central to his worldview. Hitler returned to Munich, bitter and directionless. The war had ended, but his devotion to Germany had hardened into fanaticism. In his mind, the defeat was not just military. It was moral, caused by traitors who had poisoned the nation from within. He joined the army again as a political agent, tasked with spying on small revolutionary groups. But instead of dismantling them, he was drawn to one, the German Workers' Party. Here, Hitler discovered his true weapon, not a rifle, but his voice. The war had left him radicalized. The camaraderie of soldiers, the shock of defeat, the humiliation of Versailles, all fused into a dangerous ideology. He now believed Germany could only be saved by eradicating its enemies and reclaiming lost glory through strength and purity. From the mud of the trenches, a new Hitler emerged, no longer a failed artist or drifter, but a man convinced he had been chosen to lead Germany. The soldier of war would soon become the soldier of ideology. In 1919, Hitler attended a meeting of the German Workers' Party, a tiny fringe group of angry nationalists. They raged against Jews, Marxists, and the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler possessed a rare gift, the ability to channel Germany's despair into rage. His speeches were hypnotic, theatrical, building from quiet intensity to roaring fury. The audience was captivated. Some cheered, some trembled, but none could look away. The German Workers' Party soon rebranded itself as the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the NSDAP. Hitler designed its emblem, the swastika, and its red and black flag. These symbols became instruments of psychological warfare, branding the movement with fear and power. To protect meetings and intimidate opponents, Hitler created the Sturmabteilung, the SA, or brown shirts. These paramilitary thugs patrolled streets, broke up rival gatherings, and turned politics into violent street battles. The Nazi movement grew rapidly, feeding on post-war chaos, unemployment, and fear of Bolshevism. Hitler's rallies were spectacles, mass gatherings where flags, drums, and fiery rhetoric turned despair into fanatical devotion. In November 1923, Hitler made his first bid for power, the Beer Hall Putsch. With armed followers, he tried to overthrow the Bavarian government. The coup failed, police opened fire, and 16 Nazis were killed. Hitler was arrested and charged with treason. Prison could have ended Hitler's career. Instead, it made him famous. During his trial, he turned the courtroom into a stage, using his defense to spread propaganda. Newspapers across Germany published his speeches. Sentenced to 5 years, but serving only 9 months, Hitler spent his time in Landsberg prison dictating Mein Kampf. In this book, he laid out his blueprint for conquest, anti-Semitism, and racial purification, a manifesto of hate. After release, Hitler rebuilt the Nazi Party. He abandoned coups and turned to legal means, focusing on elections, propaganda, and mass rallies. He surrounded himself with loyal lieutenants, Goebbels, Himmler, Göring, men who would help forge the Third Reich. By the late 1920s, the Nazis were still a minority party, but growing. The stage was set for the next phase. All they needed was a crisis big enough to shatter the old order and open the door to power. The Great Depression struck Germany like a plague. Millions starved, industries collapsed, and faith in democracy rotted away. Into this void stepped Hitler, a man who promised salvation but carried only ruin. His words dripped with venom, offering scapegoats and simple answers to a desperate nation. The Nazis surged in elections, becoming the largest party in the Reichstag. But they were still denied absolute power until January 30th, 1933, when President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler Chancellor of Germany. The monster was now legally at the helm of the state. Just a month later, the Reichstag went up in flames. The Nazis blamed communists, using the fire as a pretext to crush civil liberties. Under the Reichstag fire decree, mass arrests began. Fear became law, and dissent became treason. In March 1933, Hitler pushed through the Enabling Act, granting him dictatorial powers. Democracy was dead, the Weimar Republic strangled by its own legal system. Hitler had transformed Germany into a one-party state with the stroke of a pen. Rival parties were banned, unions dissolved, opponents thrown into prisons and camps. The first concentration camp, Dachau, opened in 1933, its gates waiting for anyone who dared resist. The machinery of terror had begun to grind. Even his own allies were not safe. In 1934, Hitler ordered the Night of the Long Knives, purging the SA leadership and any rivals who threatened him. The killings were swift and merciless, hundreds executed in a single night. When President Hindenburg died that same year, Hitler merged the offices of Chancellor and President, declaring himself Führer. Every soldier swore an oath of loyalty to him personally. A man had become the state, and the state became a weapon of one man's will. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels turned Hitler into a near-divine figure. Radios blared his speeches, posters plastered his image everywhere. Children were taught to worship him. The cult of personality was complete. The Gestapo stalked the streets, arresting anyone suspected of disloyalty. Neighbors informed on neighbors. Fear seeped into every home. In Hitler's Germany, silence became survival, and obedience became the only law. By 1935, Hitler had completed his transformation from failed agitator to absolute dictator. His black uniform gleamed, his speeches thundered, and Germany marched in lockstep. The monster had taken full control, and his dark vision was only beginning. With absolute power secured, Hitler began reshaping Germany into a nation forged in his own image. The Nazi state was more than a government. It was a machine of indoctrination, surveillance, and terror. Every street, every classroom, every newspaper became a tool of the regime. Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda, turned Hitler into a myth. His face stared from posters, his voice echoed from loudspeakers. Films, newspapers, and rallies told one story only: that the Führer was Germany's savior, chosen to lead a rebirth of the nation. Children were molded into future soldiers of the Reich. The Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls filled their days with marches, songs, and ideological lessons. They were taught to worship Hitler, despise Jews, and prepare for war. For Jews, Romani, and anyone labeled undesirable, life became unbearable. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 stripped Jews of citizenship, banned intermarriage, and marked them as outsiders in their own homeland. The SS, under Heinrich Himmler, became Hitler's elite enforcers, fanatical and merciless. They ran concentration camps, spied on citizens, and eliminated enemies of the state. Their black uniforms became the very symbol of fear. Political opponents, trade unionists, and dissidents vanished into prisons and camps. Early victims were worked to death or shot without trial. Hitler's ideology glorified the Aryan race as superior and condemned others as subhuman. Eugenics programs sterilized thousands deemed unfit. Disabled children were murdered under the secret T for euthanasia program. Women were told their only duty was to bear children for the Reich. Medals were awarded for large Aryan families, while others were shamed and sterilized. Hitler wanted not just to rule Germany, but to control its very bloodline. The Gestapo's web of informants spread paranoia. Friends betrayed friends. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Terror was everywhere. By the late 1930s, Hitler's Germany was no longer hiding its ambitions. Factories roared to life, building tanks and planes in secret defiance of Versailles. The army swelled, the SS grew stronger, and the world watched nervously as the Reich rearmed for war. In 1936, Hitler boldly marched troops into the demilitarized Rhineland, a direct violation of Versailles. The gamble paid off. Britain and France did nothing. The West's silence fed his arrogance. Next came Austria. In 1938, German troops rolled across the border without a shot fired. Crowds greeted them with flowers and salutes. The Anschluss, the unification of Germany and Austria, was complete, and Hitler was hailed as a conquering hero. The Sudetenland was next. Hitler demanded Czechoslovakia surrender its borderlands. At Munich, Britain and France chose appeasement, giving Hitler what he wanted in exchange for peace in our time. There would be no peace. In March 1939, Hitler broke his promise and occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. For the first time, the mask slipped. This was naked conquest. Europe finally began to prepare for war, but Hitler was already looking eastward. Hitler's obsession was Lebensraum, living space. He believed Germany's future lay in conquering the East and enslaving or exterminating its people. Poland was the first target, and plans for invasion were drawn with ruthless precision. To avoid a two-front war, Hitler struck a shocking deal with his ideological enemy, Joseph Stalin. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact secretly divided Eastern Europe between Germany and the Soviet Union. At dawn on September 1, 1939, German forces stormed into Poland. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, had begun. Tanks, planes, and infantry moved as one devastating machine. Polish cities burned, and civilians fled in terror. Britain and France declared war 2 days later. What Hitler had unleashed was no longer just a German war. It was a world war. The nightmare he had promised had arrived. As Europe descended into chaos, Hitler stood at the pinnacle of power, smiling, triumphant, believing destiny itself was on his side. But the blood he spilled had only just begun to flow. As war raged across Europe, Hitler turned his full fury on those he hated most, the Jews. What began as laws and boycotts became mass deportations, shootings, and extermination. This was not war. This was industrialized murder. The Nazi regime built a network of concentration camps, places of torture, starvation, and death. Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen became laboratories of cruelty, where prisoners were worked to death and experimented upon like animals. In 1941, the campaign of mass shootings began. Einsatzgruppen death squads swept through Eastern Europe, rounding up entire villages and executing them in pits. Children, mothers, and the elderly were gunned down in cold blood. But bullets were not enough for Hitler's vision. The final solution was born, a plan to wipe out every Jew in Europe. Death camps like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor became factories of annihilation. Trains packed with human cargo arrived day after day. Families were torn apart on the platform, some sent to forced labor, others sent directly to the gas chambers. Most never even learned their fate before they died. Inside the gas chambers, Zyklon B was released. Within minutes, hundreds were dead. Their bodies were burned, their ashes dumped in rivers and fields. The Nazis sought to erase every trace of their crime. Millions of others also perished: Romani people, disabled individuals, Soviet POWs, priests, political prisoners. The Holocaust was not only a Jewish tragedy, it was an attempt to remake humanity through murder. The few who survived spoke of starvation, torture, and cruelty beyond imagination. Yet even in hell, there were moments of defiance, secret prayers, smuggled bread, whispered songs that kept hope alive. When Allied forces finally liberated the camps, they found mountains of corpses, warehouses of hair, shoes, and glasses, mute witnesses to the scale of the genocide. Even hardened soldiers wept. The Holocaust remains the darkest chapter in human history. It was hatred made into policy, prejudice turned into genocide, and one man's vision of a perfect world built on the ashes of millions. By 1943, the tide of war had turned. The German army, once unstoppable, was bleeding on the Eastern Front. Stalingrad had fallen, and the Red Army pressed relentlessly. Hitler's vision of European domination was cracking, yet he remained in his bunker, refusing reality. Despite mounting losses, Hitler's speeches remained grandiose. He blamed generals, Jews, and traitors for setbacks, refusing to acknowledge mistakes. His mental state deteriorated. Paranoia, fits of rage, and hallucinations haunted the Führer. As 1944 began, Allies landed in Normandy, opening a Western front. Bombs fell on Berlin. Civilians fled or hid in shelters. Hitler's promises of victory were empty. The Reich was collapsing from every direction. Inside the bunker, Hitler's isolation deepened. Eva Braun joined him, but few trusted or visited. Only his closest inner circle remained: Goebbels, Bormann, Himmler. Fear and sycophancy replaced loyalty. No one dared question him. By April 1945, Soviet troops surrounded Berlin. The city burned. Hitler gave impossible orders to hold positions while his generals begged him to surrender. Reality and delusion collided. The monster of Europe was trapped in his own hell. On April 29, 1945, Hitler married Eva Braun in a quiet ceremony in the bunker. It was a last act of personal defiance amidst the total collapse of his empire, a brief moment of intimacy before death. On April 30th, Hitler committed suicide. He shot himself while Eva ingested poison. Their bodies were carried into the garden, doused in petrol, and burned as Soviet forces closed in. The Führer's reign of terror was over, but the horror he unleashed endured. The bunker was a tomb of broken dreams, paranoia, and fanaticism. Maps, papers, and trophies of conquest littered the floor. Hitler's empire, built on fear and death, had vanished in days, leaving only ruins and ashes. Across Europe, cities lay in ruin, millions were dead, and survivors struggled to comprehend the scale of destruction. Hitler's ideology had left scars that would last generations. His death ended a man, but not the horror he created. Hitler's legacy was a cautionary tale. One man's obsession, hatred, and charisma could poison millions. The moral lesson is chilling. Evil can wear the face of normalcy and promise salvation. Today, Hitler is a warning etched into human memory. Museums, memorials, and history books preserve the horror so it is never repeated. Reflection is vital: to remember the dead, to recognize the seeds of tyranny, and to fight hatred wherever it rises. The life of Adolf Hitler is a study in ambition, hatred, and monstrous human capacity. From failed artist to dictator, he reshaped the modern world through terror. The story of his reign reminds us: vigilance, morality, and empathy are the shields against the darkness one individual can unleash. If you believe history should be examined honestly, without heroes, without excuses, then you belong here.